This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. When we up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into the wrong station.
It was deep into autumn, and the last weekend of the season, and the campground was a ghost town. Just empty plot after empty plot, all sodden and trash-strewn and torn up, and the undergrowth around them stinking and burned from months of drunken piss. The campers were gone, but the broken bottles and shredded cans remained, and the shards of chewed chicken bone that would pungy stick your foot, and the piles of dog shit everywhere, sometimes loose, and sometimes seeping slowly through tears in their rain-beaded plastic bags. The rain held off as they set up camp. It felt like they were the only ones there. Or it would have, if there hadn't been the dim throb of a speaker somewhere through the woods on the campground's other side, or the chime of an 18-wheeler backing up. A forklift unloading bags of concrete mix. Maybe it hadn't been the best weekend to come up, but it had worked with all their schedules, and they'd booked and paid for it already. So after making camp, Jessa suggested they walk off the long drive by heading down to find the beach. "You want to swim?" Audrey asked. It was about 15 degrees and blustery. Fleece weather. Rain shell weather. The undersides of clouds were scudding dark beyond the pine boughs. Maybe. Jessa liked to swim cold. She brought her bathing suit anyway. Not now, but tomorrow. I just want to find out where it is. So they wandered down to the shore. Jessa and Audrey and Padma and Ryan and Padma and Ryan's dog, Oliver. "Hopefully it warms up tomorrow," Padma said. She was very pretty, but a stick, and was always holding her arms crossed across her chest against the cold. "If it doesn't, we could always leave," said Ryan. He wasn't much bigger than her, and was always anxiously tuned into her needs. "I'm staying," said Jessa. She was short and solid, dirty blonde with ruddy cheeks. "I never get out of the city. I never get to be in nature. You guys go if you want, but I'm going to stay." None of them argued with that. They were all city kids, and there was something out here they needed. But maybe that thing they needed, maybe it couldn't be found here anymore. Because whatever nature there'd once been around Rakes Point had been driven away by the electric camper lights and the grinding wheels of F-150s, and by the summer after summer of endless noise and dogs and tramping feet. Now it was quiet. It was dark. It was dirt and mud and dried trees struggling to survive. The thing they needed wasn't under these trees anymore. Any more than it would have been in an abandoned lot all overgrown in the Portlands. When they got to the beach, the sky was dimming and the water chewing at the shore in lead-gray knee-high breakers. There was nobody there except for a dead dog, lying half-decayed and sodden halfway down the sand. "Still going swimming?" Audrey teased. They stood 15 feet away from the dog. They thought it was a dog, anyway. It was big and mangy and bloated and rotten. It could have been a coyote. And even in the cold and squally spitting wind, they could smell its wet rot and feel the patter of flies bouncing off their weather jackets. "Sure am," said Jessa. "I'll stay down the other end of the beach." But since they were losing light and the beach was grim, they turned and headed back for their site. Jessa felt a heaviness on her neck. She'd been looking forward to this trip. The city had been grinding her. But now she was here, she felt none of the joy she was used to feeling in nature. She just felt lonely, despoiled, and cold. The wind picked up and the trees lashed. For a moment, their furious sound made the little humans all look up in fear. That night, Jessa woke up with a full bladder. It was late. She hated this part of camping. In the summer, bugs poured in through the slit while you fumbled with the zipper, and in the autumn, there were still bugs, but mostly it just got so cold at night. And you never had the right sleeping bag, so either you were freezing or you sweltered. And either way, the chill slammed right into your bones the moment you wormed free of the bag and clambered over sleeping friends. Your feet were always freezing when you slipped into your sandals, and the walk to the toilets was long and dark while you staggered half asleep into nothingness. That night was chill and weird and still. The trees at Rakes Point stood silent and dark. No fires, no lights, no speakers, except for somewhere far across the grounds, an obnoxious pounding like a headache in the distance. She drew her arms around herself. Her footsteps crunched down gravel track toward the comfort station. The trees seethed, and an eerie feeling stole over her, like she was being watched. Every dozen meters or so, she stopped to listen, half expecting the sound of footsteps to crunch to a stop behind her. But every time, it was just the rush of boughs, the groan of grinding branches. She shivered. Not so much from the wind as from the cold hostility pressing in from every side. The trees hated her. No wonder. Look what we've done to this place. She felt she deserved that hate, but she was desperately afraid of it. Now she was certain someone was behind her. She quickened her pace. She could feel rage and malice building in the dark behind. She imagined it was a man. He'd driven out at the end of the season to wait in the dark and ambush women with a knife. She imagined it was a bear, black-eyed and invisible, swaying drunkenly after her, thinking predatory thoughts. Then she knew it was an owl, huge, with a man's eyes and gripping hands instead of talons, falling silent through the dark. She'd hear some whisper on the air and turn in time for it to seize her head and drive its thumbs into her eyeballs, blinding her so she was trapped in the night with it forever. Then she knew it was some hateful thing of the trees themselves, a jagged scarecrow lurching as it taught itself to walk, with reaching antlered tines to pierce her to the ground and keep her pinned as it covered her mouth with one bony hand and forced itself upon her. She knew its eyes would be black voids as they stared into her, and she died. She began to run. Then the blaring whiteness of the comfort station was ahead of her, and she charged for it. She slammed the door behind her just in time and stood panting with her back against it and the smell of stale urine in her nose. But nothing slammed itself against the door behind her. Everything was quiet, but the hum and flicker of fluorescence, the little tinny clink of a moth flinging itself against the bulbs. She locked herself into a stall and sat looking at her phone for a while. All of a sudden, life was normal again. The rich girls from school were posting photos at their cottages. The Premier was letting developers turn old growth into subdivisions. Banal. She felt her heartbeat slow. Night's gruesome fantasies dispelled under the glare of white bulbs. She flushed the toilet and unlocked herself and washed her hands. But when she went outside, the dark was waiting. She made it most of the way back before she heard the twig snap. Her body whirled on its own, miles of darkness behind her, broken only by a vague dimness which seeped through black trees from the comfort station. And in that dim haze, she saw something move. A man crouched on all fours like a dog. Her breath caught. She tried to run, but she couldn't. Tried to scream, but she couldn't. The figure watched her, tilted its head. They regarded each other for a long, long time. Then it loped off and disappeared into the night. She ran back to her tent and zipped herself inside. When morning came, the others assured her she hadn't woken up at all, and she convinced herself that it had been a dream. "Oliver! Oliver!" Ryan shouted, but the dog was out of reach and bounding down the sand, bounding with the ecstasy of freedom, of being wild again and chased with no chance of getting caught. He rounded the bend and was gone, and the 4 humans rounded after him, calling his name. And halfway down the beach there was that carcass of a dog, or something like a dog, and Oliver was gaily rolling in it, in the putridness and joyful rot, getting the stink all over his coat for whatever reasons dogs so love to stink. And then when Ryan was almost in grabbing distance of his collar, Oliver barked and charged off again, this time up onto the rising grassy dunelands beyond the beach. And Ryan was after him, and the girls were after him in turn, holding sleeves to their noses as they passed the juicy carcass of that dead thing on the beach. Then they were up after him, past the yellow signs, pulling on tussocks of long grass and thin sumac until they got up onto a promontory after him. And then they were wheeling, shrieking birds, and Ryan was there with his hand on Oliver's collar shouting, bad dog," as the animal, covered in yolk and bloody albumin and little bits of crushed shell, licked avidly at the wreckage of the nest he'd charged through. The red little ruin of a bird fetus flopped through the dirt as Oliver tried to snap it up, and Ryan was wrestling at his jaw. "Drop it! Drop it!" Jessa knelt by the broken shells, feeling hollow. They were distinctive, almost a houndstooth pattern of white and feathery brown. "This is why," she said loudly, clearly. "You're supposed to keep your fucking dog on a leash." He looked up at her, wide-eyed, surprised. Clearly he'd been feeling sorry for himself, thinking of himself as the victim in Oliver's escape. "Do you know what you've just done?" she said, rising. "Do you have any idea? Did you see those yellow signs on the hillside? These are autumn pipers. They're just about extinct, and your fucking dog just smashed a whole nest of their eggs because you're too irresponsible to keep him on a leash like you know you're supposed to." "I'm sorry," said Ryan. "You should be. Look what the fuck you've done." "I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry." shouted Ryan. "Put a fucking leash on him!" Jessa could hear her own voice getting shrill. I'm sorry. He fumbled with the leash, and Padma tried to help him, looking at Jessa like she was crazy. And Audrey put her hands in her pockets and looked out at the lake so she wouldn't have to look down at the smashed eggs. "Jesus Christ," said Jessa, smoothing back her hair. "Okay, Jessa, they're just birds," said Padma. Are you... Jessa was speechless. "They're fucking endangered, Padma. There's like 100 of them left. They're just birds? They're just trees. It's just water. Fucking listen to yourself." Okay, I'm sorry," said Padma. "But it's just one nest. The Pipers will be okay, and we've learned from this and it won't happen again. We'll keep him on a leash going forward, won't we, Ryan?" "Yeah," said Ryan, breathing heavily, red-faced, still trying to control his dog as it lunged for the fetal bird. "Yeah, of course." The front of his sweatshirt and pants were smeared with the reeking gunge Oliver had picked up from the body. "Honestly, Jessa, it won't happen again." Jessa took a deep breath and bit down on what she was going to say, and turned around and looked at the lake. It was far and blue-green under the gray sky, and a mist was coming up. "Yeah," she breathed out slowly. "Yeah. Sorry I yelled at you. It's really important. And I know you're sorry, and I know it was an accident, but what you just did matters. And it's really important." "I'm sorry," said Ryan again. And then, after a moment, awkwardly, I'm just going to go clean him off," meaning the dog. "And then, he sniffed. They could all smell the death on him. And then go change." "I'll help," said Padma quickly. They dragged Oliver away. Audrey lingered for a moment. "You okay?" "Yeah," Jessa lied. "Just leave me for a moment." "Okay." Audrey hesitated at the edge of the dune. "Well, I'll meet you back at camp." When she was gone, Jessa walked out to the edge of the promontory. Her heart came up into her chest and almost broke, and she sobbed when her boots crunched over more broken eggshells. There had been a lot of nests up here. Now, after that long summer, there were only dirty eggshells and the footprints of dogs. When she'd calmed herself and come down off the dunes, her friends were gone, but there were a couple of younger guys on the beach. They were good-looking in a knockoff Chalamet kind of way, and they were wearing navy hoodies with the yellow sign of a good Toronto private school. Each of them was carrying a waterlogged 2x4, and they were taking it in turns to wind up and whack that carcass of the something like a dog back into the lake. But the poor, dead, disregarded thing was a clumsy shape, and mostly they just managed to get it to the edge of the surf, which pushed it back up the beach. They were laughing, and the sound made Jessa want to bash her head against a rock. They saw her coming, nodded at her when she got close. One of them grinned a little, and she looked from him to the sticks to the carcass, and hated him more than anyone she'd ever met. He saw her looking and looked right back, his eyes bright and bold, daring her to say something. He held his 2x4 across his hips like a hockey stick. But she didn't say anything and just walked past, ignoring it when they laughed to one another in low voices behind her, and pretending she didn't see what the hockey player started doing to his 2x4 the moment she was past. She didn't swim that day. She decided on the way back to camp that she hated the human species and never wanted anything to do with it again. That night, the campfire conversation was subdued. Ryan and Padma wouldn't really meet her eye. Jessa didn't say much, just sat in her camp chair with a lukewarm tall boy hanging from her fingertips. Audrey tried to pretend nothing was wrong, but she couldn't raise a conversation from either side of the fire and ended up looking at her phone. Through the silence of non-conversation, you could hear that distant thudding music on the campground's other side. They must have had good speakers. Maybe it was those rich kids from the beach. And there were supposed to be noise restrictions, but it was late in the season, so maybe no one cared. Or maybe they did, but the names of rich parents had scared the Rangers off. Either way, the music was louder tonight. She couldn't recognize any of the songs. She retired early and lay awake, feeling bright with hatred as the music pounded and her friends murmured about her outside. She pretended to be asleep when they finally climbed into the tent and went to bed. Sometime around midnight, the rumble of ATVs began. They ground up and down the far length of Rakes Point before opening up on the road to the south and roaring northward to the lake on the far side. The howl of engines carried through the silence. It got you in your teeth. Jessa clenched her eyes and tried to fall asleep, but as soon as the ATVs returned to their starting point, they set out again, grinding and moaning all around the circuit of the campground. She imagined every animal awake in the night in their lairs and nests, their small hearts beating rapidly as the nightmare sound bore down on them and veered away again. She could smell the exhaust through their tent. At one point, the quad swerved off track and ripped right past their campsite, so close you could feel their vibration through the ground, could hear the whoops and laughter of their riders. "The fuck?" muttered Padma, her voice thick with sleep. "Assholes," Ryan agreed. "I hope they fucking crash," said Jessa. "Too right," said Audrey. Then the four-wheelers faded back into the distance to moil up and down the far-off roads, and the others went back to sleep. But Jessa lay awake, feeling the hatred of the trees and all nature pouring down on all humanity and welcoming it, letting it all right inside where it belonged. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, when the bikes had finally gone quiet, Jessa woke again to the sound of soft footfalls creeping round their tent. From the time between them, and from the soft snap of joints, the rustle of splayed fingers in the loam, she knew it was a man moving slowly on all fours. She heard his heavy breath and smelled it through the fabric of the tent. She lay awake and listened, with her nostrils flared. Then, the day came. When she woke late, her friends were already finishing breakfast. They'd set food aside for her, and it was almost still warm. They were all exhausted from the sound of quad bikes the night before. "We're going to head out after breakfast," Ryan said. "Yeah, I think I'm done here too," said Audrey. "Not me." Jessa sat alone. "I want another day." "Well," said Audrey. The tent was hers, but she'd ridden up in Jessa's car. A bit of negotiation followed. Audrey would ride back with the couple, and Jessa would drop off the tent when she got back to town. The parting was awkward. Audrey went in for a hug, but Ryan and Padma stood at a remove while they waved farewell. It felt like breaking up. Jessa sat alone by the remains of the fire after they were gone. The morning was gray, cold. She sat alone for some time, brooding, listening to the murmur of the trees. Then she finally went swimming. That dead dog was still rotting at the waterline, but she was far enough she didn't think the water would be tainted. The lake was cold, murky, but so cold it felt pure, She knew it was dangerous to swim alone on days like this, with wind and whatever currents the lake gave up. But she was a confident swimmer and didn't venture out too far. It was lonely out there. She wished she had her friends, or even Ryan's stupid dog. When she came in off the surf, shivering, she slipped on wool socks and sandals, shorts and a heavy woolen shirt, and wandered past the rotting corpse and up into the dunes. Now it was windy, and the wind opened patches of clear blue among the clouds and let streams of pale gold sift down to warm the pale gold cordgrass and marram grass, the bright emerald of sandwort and holly, and the gold flowers of sea heather on the dunes. Past the channels left by dogs' claws and past the broken shards of eggshells, she followed a trail up onto the sunlit heights of that fragile ecosystem, following the yellow signs. At the summit, she gazed down on the blue-green lake. There was a placard here, detailing the effort conservationists had sunk into restoring these dunes. A black-and-white photograph of the old sand mine, the huge trucks that had hauled away the dunes for brick-making, cement. And then beside it, the dim color photos of men and women running stakes and wire fencing, planting stalks of grass and woody shrubs. She reached out and touched her fingers to the faded image. For a moment, she remembered what it was like to not despise humanity. For a moment, she remembered what it was to hope. Then she stopped a moment longer to drink in the beauty and calm of this place. That thing inside her, which had so needed to be nourished, was fulfilled. She almost could have cried. Then, with the wind at her back and the last warm beams of the closing sky upon her, she ventured down the narrow trail again and back toward her camp. When she got there, the woods were full of distant music and shrieks of laughter and the clash of broken glass. But she could withstand it now. She had the peace of the dunes inside her. She climbed into her tent, rested her cheek on the warm earth, and went to sleep. When she woke, the world was dim, and the woods silent but for the roar of four-wheelers. When she climbed out of her tent, the sky above was black, and the rim of the world bloody with last sunset. A deep despair throbbed in her chest, as if the heart had been scooped out of her by a blunt stone edge. For a moment, she couldn't understand why. Then, the realization seeped into her. That sound of four-wheelers was coming from the dunes. No. She set off at a dead run through the trees. She could see and feel it happening to herself. Wheels churning through the sand, ripping and uprooting fragile grass, chewing the emerald shoots and macerating golden blooms. She felt burrows collapse under the weight of steel frames, crushing the brittle bodies of rare and darting five-lined lizards, the leopard-patterned skulls of hognose snakes. She felt the eggs of endangered birds shatter and clot in the dust, the terror of small mammals as they fled the engine's roar, as whirling treads of Vulcan rubber shredded them to rags. She felt the network of life that held the land together sundered, rent, and bleeding, and all to the sound of bright, shrill laughter. She felt the world's outrage as her own. She felt completely powerless. Then the last red of day went down, and the autumn rain came cold. The trees spread all around in perfect symmetry, and she was running more tireless than ever before, and not alone. For others ran beside her in the rising dark, bounding not as humans would, but on all fours like wild dogs. Then she broke through the trees, and the wild lake lashed before her in a stern wind, and spindrift broke across the rocks and sand. There were red lights and white lights burning up and down the distant dunes, and motors roaring, laughter shrieking through the night, and she wept with hate to see despoiled this last unspoiled refuge in her desecrated world. The other bounding things were lost behind her in the darkness at the edges of the trees. But in the mist and shadow of the beach, she saw a huge man, crouched like a beast with his fingers in the sand. The gloom silhouetted him against the chaos of the sea and sand and sky, but she thought she saw a jagged pallidness of teeth within his jaw. And maybe it was only the bare sumacs rising behind him on the dunes, but it looked as though his head was antler-crowned. Then she ran toward him, and he was gone. No horned protector on the blowing sand. Nothing but the drowned and mangled body of a dog, or something like a dog. She fell to her hands and knees beside it, and the rain came over her. Negligence and cruelty and bitterness and loss. She lamented her human form. She wished she had a weapon she could use to kill all humankind. Then, her clawed fingers crept through the sand and found the wetness of that broken carcass. And in the blackened crater of its bored, cracked skull, she found the teeth inside, still bright and whole and razor sharp. She wrapped her fingers around them, and lo, the moldering jaws came away cleanly, darkly from its battered skull. She pulled strands of blackened muscle from the mandibular joint, and stood slowly with the dog jaws in her palm. And they gleamed, beaded as with crystal in the misting rain. Then she did something that surprised her. She raised those teeth to her mouth, and as smoothly as they slid from the head of the dog, so smoothly did they slide into place in her own lips and over her own teeth. Then she was reborn and strong. She knew that she could run till sunrise, that she could smell 100 miles in the dark. All the world was bright and clear to her. Her purpose was a bright star shining in the dark. Still, the headlights and taillights burned red and white on the dunes above, and with clear slaver running down the front of her coat, staining it here and there with bits of curdled blood or rotten meat, she set off toward them at a run. A fierce joy was on her as she bounded through the rising dunes. She was with her enemy in the dark, and the wild was with her.
The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/The Wrong Station. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, With Dog's Teeth, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Abigail Turner. Thank you to Cecilia Jones, Lori, Lana Mallon, Lyra, Stephanie Kovacs, and Vitreous Humor for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.